The US President Donald Trump has strongly rejected French President Emmanuel Macron's earlier claims that Trump had left the G7 summit in Canada to return to Washington and work on a ceasefire between Israel and Iran. In a post on Truth Social, President Donald Trump accused French President Emmanuel Macron of being publicity seeking and saying Macron has no idea why he returned to Washington, adding that it was much bigger than that. Trump also remarked that Macron always gets it wrong and urged followers to stay tuned. President Trump clarified that his reasons for leaving the G7 summit were mistakenly described by Macron and emphasized that his early exit had nothing to do with any efforts to broker a ceasefire between the two Middle Eastern countries. Earlier at the G7 summit in Kananaskis, President Macron told reporters that the US has made an offer to work on a ceasefire between Israel and Iran. President Donald Trump departed the summit early, boarding Air Force One in Calgary after tensions escalated in the Middle East. G7 leaders meanwhile issued a strong joint statement expressing firm support for Israel and calling Iran a source of instability. They stressed that Iran must never obtain a nuclear weapon and backed Israel's right to defend itself. The statement also called for broader regional de-escalation, including a ceasefire in Gaza. US President Donald Trump and British Prime Minister Keir Starmer have announced a trade agreement on the sidelines of the G7 summit. The deal reduces tariffs on UK automobiles and eliminates tariffs on the British aerospace sector. However, key issues remain unresolved, particularly US quotas and tariffs on steel and aluminum imports from the UK. Meanwhile, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney said he and President Trump have agreed to pursue a new economic and security deal between the US and Canada within the next 30 days. The two leaders met earlier at the summit in Alberta amid ongoing disagreements over tariffs on Canadian metals and automobiles. Also in Kananaskis, Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba and President Trump ended their meeting without a breakthrough. The two sides pledged to continue trade negotiations, but a major sticking point, especially in US tariffs on Japanese cars, remain unresolved. Let's listen in to what Ishiba had to say.
これまで日本、アメリカ双方が本当に真摯な議論を精力的に続けました。で、ギリギリまで交渉の可能性を探ってきておるところであります。今なお双方の認識が一致していない、そういう点が残っておりますので、パッケージ全体としての合意には至っておりません。我が国にとって、例えて言えば自動車というのは本当に大きな国益であります。こういうことの国益を守り抜くために、我々として最善の努力を重ねるということにつきます。これは双方相手のあることでございますので、我が国の国益を守る必要があると、これを守り抜かねばならないということでありますから、いつまでにということを申し上げることは困難でございます。
Now we have guest Peter Baum. He's a foreign editor of Weekly Blitz, joining us for this discussion live from London. Thank you for joining us today. Trump has declared a US-UK trade deal done after meeting Keir Starmer. Is this a breakthrough or political theater?
I think it's probably both. Clearly, the bargain between the UK and the US on this particular issue will be seen as a win for both parties. But there's still a lot more to go before the UK can breathe a sigh of relief. Hopefully in the weeks to come there will be other similar deals. I think it is a bit of political posturing, and certainly Mr. Trump's departure from the G7 I believe is a real snub to Mark Carney, who was posturing to be the one of the in his new role as Canadian Prime Minister, was posturing to be seen to be a world leader of some stature. Frankly, Donald Trump's early departure has been a slap in the face to him, as has his outrageous comments, which he made about President Macron. I mean, clearly a global insult on President Macron. There's no love lost between himself and President Trump, and certainly no love lost between President Trump and Mark Carney. But with Keir Starmer, there is a kind of a much better personal relationship, and this particular trade deal must be seen as, I think, for both countries.
And staying on this topic, why do you think the US-Japan talks did not produce any formal trade deal? What might be holding that relationship back here?
Yeah, now this is an interesting one, and I think it actually goes back to some of the things President Trump was saying when he first got elected. The Japanese motor industry has been a global success worldwide. Whatever country you go to in Europe, and certainly in the United States, you will see Japanese manufactured cars all over the place. When you go to Japan, as I do often, you hardly see an American car on the Japanese roads. Now, is it because the Japanese don't like the way American cars are manufactured? They don't like the shape, they don't like the model? No, of course it's not. It's because of the punitive tariffs that the Japanese impose on American car exports. Now, I believe that no agreement was made simply because of this one particular part of the industrial cycle, and that is the inability of Japan to decrease punitive tariffs on American exported cars.
Well, I would like to also add that Japanese streets are too narrow, so American cars might not be the best fit there. And moving on to next question, as a foreign editor, do you think global institutions like the G7 are being weakened by these parallel crises and leader-specific agendas?
The G7, whenever it's met, has always faced crises around the world, and this is no different to any other G7 meeting. I think what's at play here now is political posturing. Going back to your very first question, there are some issues, personal issues, amongst the leaders of G7. Don't forget, although on the face of it, Keir Starmer and President Macron seem to be getting on very well together, the French are actually really doing a lot of damage to the British economy by allowing thousands of immigrants from France to leave France on boats to the UK. And although the British government is paying France hundreds of millions of dollars to stop the outflow of immigrants, the French are doing nothing. So there's some other factors at work here, which I'm sure Keir Starmer and President Macron will discuss behind the scenes. So again, to answer your question, there are the G7 has always faced external crises, political issues. This is no different to any other G7 meeting. How it's handled, however, is very different. No other American president, I think, would have acted the way Donald Trump has behaved and left early and frankly insulted his host by leaving early and outwardly being very offensive to President Macron.
And taking that point further, does Trump's behavior suggest he sees the G7 less as a multilateral forum and more as a stage for bilateral deals?
Actually, I think probably he does, and he's managed to do some bilateral deals. There was, I think, in the introduction, you suggested that Carney and Trump were going to discuss trade deals in the next 2 weeks. He's undertaken a deal with Keir Starmer. He tried to do something with the Japanese Prime Minister. That hasn't come off. And I think, yes, you're right. I think he looks upon G7 as a forum to be transactional rather than being collegiate economically.
And what does Modi's invitation to the G7 suggest about India's rising international relevance, even outside of the G7 framework? And how would you describe the tone and unity of the G7 so far?
The tone and unity of the G7 so far has attempted to be as collegiate as possible. The statement on the Iran-Israel issue seemed to be reasonable enough. I think only Japan was a dissenting voice, and you're always going to get at least one dissenting voice. So I think so far those that are staying in the G7 in front of the public glaze have handled it pretty well. They could do nothing about Donald Trump's departure. As far as President Modi's coming into the G7, India can be and is a huge economic powerhouse. Every G7 country would like to do much more business with India, which has a dynamic and intelligent workforce than it's already doing. So I think Modi's presence is significant. Don't forget also, Mexico and Brazil are also being represented at G7. I'm not sure whether Ramaphosa of South Africa is actually going there, but this is obviously to do with the BRICS group of nations. But to answer your question, Modi's presence is very significant because, as I said before, every G7 nation would like to be doing much more business with India, an economic powerhouse and a growing economic powerhouse, than it's currently already doing.
And before we move on, I would like to also ask that, does the summit's location being Canada and the host being newly elected President Carney, Prime Minister Carney's role as host affect the tone of priorities in G7 and the discussions that take in Canada this year?
I'm not sure. I think Mark Carney, with his quite a remarkable victory in Canada, wanted to leverage up on that domestic success. Although he was governor of the Bank of England, which in itself is a rather unique and prestigious role, make no mistake, he wasn't a very good governor of the Bank of England. Although people outside of the United Kingdom wouldn't necessarily recognise that. So I think having the G7 meeting in Canada was a chance for him to increase his profile globally and certainly to further endorse his popularity domestically.
Thank you very much, Peter Baum, for joining us today and sharing your expertise as a foreign editor. Now we move on to our next story. The Iran-Israel war has